Alright, well lads, so I've got some news. I've been really trying to get into bagels recently, but I wasn't too sure where to start, so I decided, you know what, I'm gonna dive head first into it. There's this competitive bagel making community, and apparently they've got an event on today, so let's just go and try it. They said to start with sandwiches. The beginner. We all gotta start somewhere. No matter the field you're in, no one can just jump into the deep end if they have no experience. And to help you learn, we have the training wheels, the easy tasks, the things you need when you're just starting off, because as I just learned, you can't send someone straight into making bagels. You need to start with the basics. The beginner character. Most games that have characters tend to have a simple, straightforward one intended to be used by new players, so that they can have an easier time picking up the game, standard stuff that we're all used to. But there are varieties of beginner characters that date back way further than the online multiplayer games that you think spawned them in. One of the first examples, at least that I have experience with, can be traced back to the Game Boy with Pokemon and the early game bug type. Caterpie, Weedle, Wurmple, really whichever bug of your choosing that you find on Route 1 has one goal. Teach the player that Pokemon evolve. And obviously while you don't have to, their lower stat line does indicate that after they've served their teaching purpose, the player would want to take them out of the party and swap over to a stronger Mon. And this is true enough of most beginner characters. While it's never directly said, it is typical for the players to learn the game with one or two of the options and then branch out from there to try out whoever they wish after they get the basics down. But before we start looking through examples, let's just lay some groundwork so that we all know what to expect from these so-called beginner characters. Number 1, they don't have much going on. The filling of a starter character has to be plain and understandable. They need to be kept simple, because imagine handing an aspiring bagel maker an egg in a pan and expecting them to know how to make a breakfast bagel. Keep it simple, ham and cheese. Number 2, in line with their simplicity, they provide a lot of value just by existing. These beginner-friendly characters don't need as much effort as their harder counterparts in order to provide the same level of value. The same way that bread, which shares the same descriptor as me, doesn't need much extra to fill my stomach when I'm hungry at 3 in the morning. And number 3, as mentioned with the Pokemon example, obviously beginner characters help teach the player. They're like mini tutorials. Sometimes they're specialized, like with Pokemon and Evolution, but other times they're more generalized, just as a way to help players get familiar with the game, mostly so they'll understand that this isn't what was meant when the instructions said put butter on the bread. It's pretty intuitive as to what a beginner character is. Something intended by the devs to be a little bit easier to play and to put out good value for lower effort, all's for the sake of making the learning experience a little bit easier for the newer players. However, within that, we can find a balancing issue as always. Once players are experienced, if these easier to play characters are actually stronger than their harder to play counterparts, well, problems will arise. The game quality will dip because you gotta remember that players will always optimize the fun out of a game. And this brings me to the main point I want to bring up. These beginner characters are often designed to be non-meta, or they're just kept purposefully weak, because if they're strong, then they turn the game on its head. Due to their simplicity, there's often not as much for players to play around, especially because there's a lower margin of error for their pilot. And all this, of course, is coupled alongside the fact that they're always much stronger in lower elos, so if they're strong across all elos, they're going to be wreaking absolute havoc down there. So with all that in mind, I like to take a look at beginner characters across games. The good, the questionable, and the everything in between. Because evidently I need to, so that I can actually understand the beginner character that the bagel community recommended to me. So in general, there tends to be two types of beginner characters, the all-rounders and the specialists. Obviously, this is a massive generalization. There are characters who don't really fit into either pile, which I'll get into, so just stick with me. Within these two, you'll find a variety of talking points for different problems and great ideas. And with that, I'm going to start off with our jack of all trades, but I also want to clarify something with my examples. I'm not going to be bringing up fighting games as a whole here, as while yes, a lot of the more beginner-friendly characters tend to be more balanced all-round characters, focusing on doing a little bit of everything, whether we're looking at Mario and Smash or Ryu and Street Fighter. I just don't have enough experience with the genre to do that discussion justice. Could you tell? Now, while the concept of an all-rounder, a jack of all trades and master of none, does imply that they do a little bit of everything yet excel at nothing, that exact definition doesn't perfectly apply outside of a single-player or co-op environment. I mean Commando in Risk of Rain 2, Gunner in Deep Rock Galactic, Excalibur in Warframe, or even something like the Sword and Shield in Monster Hunter. In these single player and co-op environments, characters that can do a little bit of everything in every sense of the word are more common, as they're generally the only or one of the only starting points as far as characters to play go in these games. But in multiplayer, especially when characters who are often sorted into roles are what we actually play, a little bit of everything just technically is not possible, but it will still be provided to a certain effect. All-rounders are a great way to help new players pick up your game, since it'll get them to grips with several aspects all at once, working as great introductions to make sure that they understand the game as a whole, and one of the best examples of this can be found in a game that doesn't actually use characters in the sense that I've been talking about them. Splatoon and the Splattack Jr. are the perfect example of a jack-of-all-trades, master of none, intended to help new players come to understand the game, and it isn't even a character in the way that I've been implying this entire time. It has crutches to help out new players, like a bigger ink tank and full invincibility on its special, but its damage is pretty unremarkable, teaching new players that it's a lot more important to cover the map rather than kill, giving it that lower effort for higher value that I was talking about earlier, alongside the great message to the player that they shouldn't be laser focused on trying to kill the other players. But within that low effort for a high value, it doesn't provide as much value as other weapons would because of the fact it has such low damage, which specifically in Splatoon 1 really doesn't work out well because the later into its lifespan the game got, the more kill heavy the meta became. So Splatoon 1 had a very typical starter character, or weapon in its case. It served the main idea and taught new players the general goals of the game, but it still fell off the more skilled players got, as it just couldn't keep up with stuff like the slosher. All very typical stuff that you would expect from a beginner weapon, not designed to be super strong once players are experienced, and has a solid balance to it. Then Splatoon 2 came along and threw Splatoon 1's carefully crafted bagel out the window. In case you couldn't tell, the junior line of weapons are intended to be babies for Splatoon. They're designed with ink coverage in mind, dealing low damage to let players know that the game isn't all about killing. However, because they have such good spread and quick fire rate for coverage, it means that they charge their specials way quicker than other weapons, and that's our key here. The Canto Splattershot Jr. abuses this strength because it has an incredibly good sub and special combo in torpedoes and the bubble blower, which effectively just give the Canto Jr. the damage that it lacks, turning it into a near perfect weapon. Thanks to the sub and special, it has good damage, it has good range, and by extension good ink coverage because of its larger ink tank. And of course, the sub and specials that it charges up like crazy that I just mentioned also do a great job at help covering the map in even more ink. While the original Splattershot Jr. was an all-rounder, it didn't excel in any one area, bar maybe ink coverage, but its weakness in low damage made up for this, allowing for it to function well as a typical lower effort for high value introductory method. But once the Canto Jr. comes along and it removes that damage weakness, its all-round nature becomes its biggest strength, because it doesn't lose out in any department while still having this lower effort being needed to obtain a high value nature. And this is even helped by the fact that it actually only kills in about 4 bullets. And this is a running theme in why beginner characters can nearly never be allowed to be strong. Since they're simple in nature, once their strength reaches a tipping point, they become one of, if not the strongest option in the game. It's rare to find a jack-of-all-trades beginner character who doesn't fall off the higher you climb, because they have to be designed to be non-meta, or else they become the strongest option possible. However, it is possible to have this type of character be nearly perfectly balanced at all levels within the right circumstances. And for this, I want to point to Soldier 76 in Overwatch 1, and specifically Soldier 76 in Overwatch 1. And we'll get into why that is in just a moment. Soldier is your typical I used to play Call of Duty and scream slurs at strangers over Xbox Live hero shooter character. He's the most bog standard FPS character you could create. Rifle, sprinting, self-heal, and some form of explosive. And he's always been the gateway to help players who come from more traditional FPSs get used to the faster pace of Overwatch. Obviously stemming from the fact that he's very similar to a Call of Duty character, but also because he's very forgiving. He was one of the few non-support characters that had a way to heal themselves back in Overwatch 1. He's less punished for missing shots since he uses a rifle, and of course his ultimate does the aiming for you. You can't get much more forgiving than that. And near the end of Overwatch 1's lifespan, he was in a very good place. 20 damage per bullet gave him good breakpoints, and he was a rare example of a beginner-friendly all-rounder who could perform well at all levels of play. And then Overwatch 2 came along and threw Overwatch 1's carefully crafted bagel out the window. I'm starting to notice a pattern with sequels here. Now, unlike Splatoon, Soldier didn't become a menace in Overwatch 2, unless you're going to count the 2 kills and 13 deaths Soldier on your team a menace, in which case, Yeah, he did become one. But also, unlike Splatoon, Soldier didn't actually receive any major additions or the like. He could crit during ult now and got a nerf to his damage, though because of his simplicity, this damage nerf was a massive thing. He hasn't gotten 20 damage per bullet back at any stage during Overwatch 2, and with the Season 9 HP pool patch causing the nature of the game to step towards burst damage, he's just fallen off, which isn't helped at all by his ultimate, which is just not good once players learn that they shouldn't stand in the middle of nowhere. While it's not confirmed, it's logical enough to assume that they won't buff Soldier, since he's a very popular and fairly strong pick in lower ranks. I personally only see one viable method of fixing Soldier that isn't a simple numbers buff, being to rework his ultimate, but in doing that, you damage the idea of him being a beginner-friendly character. Now, while that may be how Blizzard sees it, consider that a lot of people who play Soldier are probably going to be FPS players, and I think giving them an ultimate that doesn't play the game for them would cause no harm anywhere. Soldier presents an interesting and honestly very common situation for characters like these. Since they're so straightforward, simple changes like the addition of one singular point of damage can completely flip their strength. But even if those changes are applied sometimes, the core design just doesn't lend itself to the modern state of the game if it's been out for several years, and in most cases, these characters are just left to rot. Because if you want to keep them for new players to pick up, you can't touch how they function at their core, though this idea then presents a new issue, being that most tutorials do a pretty bad job of teaching new players, which creates this artificial demand for easier characters so that players can properly learn how to play the damn game. So while a jack of all trades has its pros and cons as we've seen, there's also a much more interesting side to the Training Wheels character, one which also happens to be a lot more volatile: the extremists. While sandwiches are a good starting point for any and all looking to get into whole-based bread activities, they can definitely be described as an all-rounder. What do you do if you're struggling with only one specific part of bagel creation? That's when you pull it out. The bread roll. Look, there's so much bread in my house right now, we need to find some kind of use for it. So specialist beginner characters, as I'm calling them, are effectively the exact opposite of all-rounders, focusing on one or two specific things to teach the player certain ideas. Despite this different approach though, they still typically end up having the same problems as all-rounders, being that as the skill of play increases, their effectiveness decreases, because they have to be kept as unviable picks, or else their main strength becomes something that can't be beaten. There's also another issue they face, specifically as teaching devices, being that because they're designed to excel in specific areas, if a player learns the game through their scope, they can develop bad habits, since no other character would do similar things. So we may as well start off with some examples of who I think good extremist characters are, and I would say there's no pair better than Moira and Seris from Overwatch and Paladins. Both of these characters challenge the pre-established idea that some may have going into these games, being that supports only heal. How do they challenge it? They both have a higher focus on dealing damage, and in Moira's case, all she can do is heal and damage. Both force players to do more than just heal bot. In Moira's case, she needs to do damage in order to heal, and with Seris, you're missing out on her stun if you don't damage enemies. And of course, as always, both of these characters are pretty simple to control. Seris's heal is auto-targeted and her orbs are gigantic AoEs, and then Moira has basically the same, but swapped around. It also helps that both characters have an ability to help them reposition safely. Both the teaching principles and mechanical aspects of these characters are perfect as novice-friendly options, and you could argue that Seris is actually an all-rounder rather than an extremist, though I label her as such since she can never heal and damage at the same time. It's always either or. And of course, as per usual, both of these characters are terrible the higher up you go. They can work, especially in Moira's case, she has her uses the higher you go in Overwatch, but also consider that Moira is very rarely top of the meta, because if she is, it's because her numbers are damn near unbeatable. In Seris's case, she can nearly never reach a strong state because of the fact she can never heal and do something else at the same time, unlike practically every other support in Paladins. But despite that, I would say she's a perfect way to learn support because of the fact that she teaches players well, which is something that I can't exactly say about Moira. As much as I just praised these two, specifically Seris, Moira does have one major issue which is also part of her strength. Sure, she does teach a player that supports do more than heal, they're meant to do damage as well. But the thing is, she only has healing and damage. Every other support in Overwatch has utility of some variety. The other beginner-friendly character in Mercy has res, Lucio has speed, Ana has anti-nade and sleep, Zen has Discord Orb to increase damage, you get the idea. Moira is the only support that doesn't provide utility of some variety to her team, meaning she can end up teaching players a bad habit of not using their utility or simply using it incorrectly, such as keeping Suzu as a healing tool instead of a cleansing one, or only using Lucio's amp to make his heal stronger. And this is coming from experience. One of my friends who got into Overwatch and started with Moira would never go for aggressive anti-nades. He always kept it as a heal boost despite being told it's a situational ability. And there is the secondary issue Moira and by extension Ceres has as well, which is actually within their strengths yet again. Their movement options are just get out of jail free cards, especially in Moira's case, which can end up having players who never know how to position since they're so used to their positional errors not being punished as they have a way to immediately rectify them. And of course the other issue she faces, which to a certain extent is linked to her simplicity and introductory nature, is that balancing her is quite the balancing act because all there is to work with is numbers, just like as I was mentioning with Soldier earlier on. She's not like Ana, where even as the duration of sleep and anti-nade get lower, she remains strong due to the actual utility effect of them. If Moira receives changes, it's generally to damage or healing numbers, meaning that there's a sweet spot where it isn't too much or too little, but often she still has to suffer on a verge of weakness. The sweet spot is weak. And this is something that applies to simple characters across the board. Unlike their more complex counterparts, mere number changes can change their pressure overnight. Take League for example, where someone like Aurelion Sol can have his Q damage nerfed, but they have several things to target. The AP ratio on the burst, the Stardust percentage, the damage per tick, or even the ticks per second. If only one got nerfed, yeah, it's weaker than before, but he can still manage. Now, if you take that idea and look at J4, this guy comes in and out of the meta depending on how big of a shield his W gives him. Ceres and Moira definitely have their problems, but that's also what comes with the territory of being this type of character. You'd be hard pressed to find a beginner character that doesn't have problems. But as a way to get new players into the game and teach them certain fundamentals, I would say they do that job near perfectly. And I would say that this is a teacher who showed up to work hungover, put on a video for the wrong subject, and told the kids that if they want to start making bagels, they're going to be better off just buying them from the deli because they'll amount to nothing. They're 8-year-olds, don't tell them that, they'll believe anything! Yumi is one of the worst designed characters that frequently gets recommended to beginners ever. Sure, mechanically she's very easy, you don't even need to worry about positioning or death, just sit on your ally and give them shields, a permanent buff, and slow down enemies with your one skill shot. How could you not recommend this to a beginner? All they have to do is sit still and do one thing all game. Because they just have to sit still and do one thing all game. Despite what people make it out to seem, support is not the easiest role in League, but that doesn't change the fact that it has some great characters to help people learn the game and the role, like Nami or Nautilus. Yumi, however, is an affront to the very concept of learning. You know how I mentioned earlier that extremists can teach bad habits? In Moira's case, it's honestly minor, and something that the players could figure out themselves if given enough time. But Yumi? Not only does Yumi fail to teach basic support concepts like positioning, vision control, and even just movement, she actively discourages players from even attempting to try and learn those concepts. Yumi's game plan consists of singing off and sucking the praises of whoever her strongest ally is, which, sure, isn't too far off from the idea of a support, but that doesn't change the fact it's all she can do. I mean, just by existing, she gives her allies a buff. It's as close to low effort for good value as you can get, but the most important aspect of support in League is vision control, placing wards and removing the enemies. But Yumi cannot operate by herself. A Yumi caught out on her own has infinitely less chance of survival than any other support in the game. All of this is combined with how mechanically stunted a new player would be if they learn through Yumi. Her skill shots can barely be considered as such. Her positioning is literally just whatever her allies are doing, and she provides nothing to the player in regards to interacting with enemies outside of her Q and ult, which again are reliant on her teammates to begin with. Compared to a support like Nami, Morgana, or even Soraka or Sona, Yumi just doesn't teach the player anything meaningful at all, and instead just teaches them horrendous habits that will harm them down the line. This is the worst possible type of character you could advertise to new players. Sure, Moira can end up teaching players bad habits, but like I said, they can be rectified in due time, and Moira can still teach the most basic of basics, like movement, positioning, and even supporting the team. Yumi does none of that. She doesn't teach players how to position, she doesn't teach them how to help their entire team, and she doesn't even teach them how to control the damn game. There are no other supports in League that Yumi can transfer her skill set over to as well, as every other support does need to keep the basic concept of positioning in mind. You can design an extremely niche character in a game, absolutely, go for it, but such niche characters should never be offered to players having their first experience within a game. Well, I've now explained the two types of beginner characters along with their potential problems while framing them as different baked goods. So now I have a choice. I could be normal and talk about the type of characters that I don't think fall into either camp, or I could be funny. Baps are weird, like you're telling me this is a bread roll and a bagel combined into one? Oh shit, right, games. So there were honestly a lot of characters that didn't fall into either the all-rounder or specialist type as I was coming up with this, so why not let's have a third category for the things Rory doesn't know what to call. A lot of these characters are still simple, and some of them actually do well in all ranks. You could call them outliers to the categories I had initially thought of, with the first one I want to bring up as well being Warwick. And look, I swear this is the last League mention of the video, and I'll punish myself for it once we're done. So why do I think Warwick is a great beginner character who also works well as skill increases? Probably because I play him. Bias? Absolutely. He's good training wheels for new junglers since his clear is healthy, his W forces them to look around the map, and mechanically, let's be real, he's damn simple. A lot of the skill with playing him comes down from macro and very small bits of micro like Q follows, but that's something that applies to nearly every simple character. They inverse on their design the higher in skill you get, as thanks to their straightforwardness, the other players are aware of your game plan, so it's on you to beat them despite the pre-established knowledge they'll have. Though, to move on from your least favorite relative, let's look at your least favorite relative's best friend. In Valorant, there are a good few characters you could argue that are good for beginners. Sage, being one of the two healers, always provides strong value so long as she's alive. Brimstone has the easiest to use and long-lasting smokes, allowing him to be a good teaching tool for players unfamiliar with how to use them. And of course there's Gecko, who can just plant the spike without committing a person to it. That is the definition of low effort for high value, alongside the fact he can pick up and reuse all his cooldowns, meaning he isn't as punished as other agents for a mistake. Even just sticking within shooters for a moment, Bangalore and Lifeline from Apex are the two most introductory characters in its cast. I mean, I don't need to explain how a healing drone is useful, and for Bangalore, the extra move speed when being shot at helps new players live just that little bit longer. And of course I could go on about Neith or Aphrodite in Smite, whose abilities you practically have to try and miss when using, or I could keep going on and on about League and Overwatch's beginner-friendly characters for hours, but the general populace has other ideas. Even though beginner characters have their potential problems, that doesn't change the fact that they're important and honestly necessary parts of games. Sure, they're often designed to be non-meta, effectively designed to be disposed of once they've served their learning purpose. But sometimes that is a result of inefficient tutorials that leaves players lost, so they need the easier characters to help them get to grips with things. It's obviously possible to design simple characters that work great in higher elos, just look at Lifeline or Warwick, but it's equally as possible to make these simple characters in general work in skilled environments, even if they're purposely kept weak by the developers. Which has led me to realize something. Just because a character is easier to play than another doesn't mean you have to play them if you're just trying to get into the game. Just play whoever you enjoy, because that will give you the best learning experience regardless of if the character is seen as a good or bad teaching tool. And you know what? I'm gonna prove to the bagel community that I don't need these introductory baked goods in order to make good bagels. I want to get into bagels, damn it, and get into bagels I shall!
I should have stuck to sandwiches.